Imagine a father and his young son, their laughter echoing through the canyons, setting out on a celebratory birthday weekend. The mountains were their sanctuary, the trails their playground, and the future stretched out bright before them. They never returned. They simply vanished, swallowed by the rugged, unforgiving Sierra Nevada. For 5 agonizing years, their family was left with only silence, trapped in a cold, permanent grief. The case went cold, a haunting local mystery with no clues and no answers. But then, in a desolate canyon miles away, a lone hiker stumbled upon something impossible, something wedged 160 feet high in a sheer cliff face. A discovery so bizarre, so chilling that it would not only reignite the investigation, but also expose a truth far darker and more sinister than a simple accident. The mountains hadn't just taken them. They had been hiding a cold-blooded murder. This is the story of Garrett and Bryson Kinsley, a story of a family torn apart by a single senseless act. It's a mystery that defied every logical explanation, and the extraordinary series of events that finally brought a killer to justice. This is a journey into the heart of a father's love, a son's tragic last ride, and the chilling crime that left a child's fate unknown. Before we begin this emotional journey, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and join our community. Your support helps us bring these incredible and often heartbreaking tales to light. It was the evening of July 15, 2017. Olivia Kinsley, a nurse by profession, was driving home from a grueling 12-hour shift at the local hospital. The residual stress was a familiar ache in her shoulders, but tonight, a different, more unsettling feeling had crept in, a quiet, gnawing anxiety that she couldn't quite place. She was waiting for her phone to ring as it always did. Her husband Garrett and their 12-year-old son Bryson were on one of their mountain biking adventures, and the day always ended with a check-in call. Garrett was a man of routine, a meticulous planner who believed in constant communication, especially when they were deep in the wilderness. But as she pulled into the quiet, dark driveway of their home, the silence in her car felt heavier, more significant than usual. The quiet was a tangible thing, a weight pressing down on her chest. Garrett, 37, and Bryson, 12, were nearly 200 miles away, deep in the rugged Sierra Nevada mountains near Lake Tahoe. This wasn't just a casual weekend getaway. This was Bryson's birthday trip, meticulously planned by Garrett to celebrate his son's milestone. Mountain biking was their shared passion, their unique language, a sport that had bound them together since Bryson was old enough to ride. Garrett was more than just a hobbyist. He was a seasoned expert with over a decade of experience, a professional who made his living designing and developing some of the most challenging mountain bike trails in the country. He understood the risks, respected the unforgiving terrain, and always prepared for every possible contingency. This trip was designed to be the perfect blend of challenge for Garrett and celebration for Bryson. Their itinerary was packed with 2 days of riding some of the most renowned technical trails in the Tahoe region, punctuated by a stay at a comfortable resort with a pool, a specific luxury Bryson had requested. Olivia, who did not share their passion for steep descents and high speeds, had stayed home. Inside her quiet house, the feeling of unease lingered. She checked her phone again. No missed calls. No texts. A few hours earlier, Garrett had sent a quick message confirming their arrival at the resort, before they geared up and headed for the trails. They were supposed to be back by evening, likely exhausted, dusty, and ready for dinner and a swim. As the evening wore on, Olivia tried to rationalize the lack of communication. Tahoe is remote, she told herself. Cell service is notoriously spotty on the deeper trails. Perhaps they had returned later than expected and were already soaking in the resort's hot tub, their phones forgotten in their room. She decided not to worry. They were capable, they were together, and Garrett was meticulously safe. With a heavy heart, she went to bed, assuming she'd wake up to a voicemail full of apologies and excited recounts of the day's ride. But the morning of July 16th brought a different kind of dread. Olivia was back at the hospital for another demanding shift. The work was consuming, requiring her full attention, but the continued silence from Garrett and Bryson began to gnaw at the edges of her focus. It was a persistent, terrifying whisper in her mind. During her lunch break, she sent another text, remained undelivered. She tried calling. It went straight to voicemail. By mid-afternoon, having still heard nothing, the fragile rationalizations of the previous night completely crumbled. It was completely unlike Garrett to be out of touch for this long. The moment her shift ended, the anxiety that had been simmering all day escalated into a sharp, cold fear. Sitting in the hospital parking lot, still in her scrubs, she dialed the number for the resort near Tahoe. The conversation started routinely enough. The front desk clerk confirmed that Garrett Kinsley and his son had checked in the previous morning. But when Olivia asked to be connected to their room, there was a pause. The clerk checked the system again. According to their records, the keycards for their room hadn't been used since the initial check-in. Housekeeping reported that the room was untouched, the beds hadn't been slept in, and the luggage was still in the corner, undisturbed. The devastating realization hit Olivia with a physical force that stole her breath. Her husband and son hadn't been relaxing by the pool. They had seemingly vanished from the side of a mountain. They had been missing for over 24 hours. Her husband and son, her entire world, were gone. With a trembling voice, she immediately contacted the local sheriff's department in the Tahoe area. Reporting her husband and son missing, she provided the necessary details. She described Garrett's expertise, their planned itinerary as best she knew it, and the equipment they were using. Authorities asked for a recent photograph. Olivia emailed them an image taken just a few weeks prior on a different trail. The image showed a grinning Garrett in a blue helmet and red-lensed sunglasses next to Bryson, who was wearing a white and red helmet and orange goggles. Bryson stood proudly with his distinctive red and white full-suspension mountain bike, its white rear suspension coil clearly visible. Garrett's cyan-colored bike was partially visible next to him. This photograph, a snapshot of their perfect life, would soon be circulated far and wide, marking the beginning of a desperate search for the missing father and son. The mobilization around Lake Tahoe was immediate and extensive. The Sierra Nevada mountains, while breathtakingly beautiful, were a maze of granite cliffs, dense pine forests, and treacherous terrain. When the Placer County Sheriff's Office received the report from Olivia Kinsley, the urgency was palpable. A child was missing, along with an experienced adult, and the critical 48-hour window for a successful rescue was already beginning to close. The first critical task for the search and rescue SAR coordinators was establishing a starting location. This came relatively quickly. By the early hours of July 17th, Garrett Kinsley's vehicle was located at the popular Granite Loop trailhead. It was parked normally, locked, and undisturbed. A cursory inspection revealed nothing unusual inside, no signs of a struggle, no note left behind, just the typical residual items of a weekend trip. The discovery confirmed their entry point into the wilderness. However, the Granite Loop was a central artery, a hub connecting to a vast network of trails spanning hundreds of square miles of rugged backcountry. The complexity of the search was amplified by the victim profile. Garrett Kinsley wasn't a tourist who might wander off a main path and get lost. He was a professional trail developer, a man who could read topography like a language and possessed elite riding skills. This expertise paradoxically made the search harder. While a novice might be found close to the main trails, Garrett and Bryson, who was also highly skilled for a 12-year-old, were capable of accessing the most remote, technical, and dangerous routes in the region. The search area was therefore exponentially larger and far more treacherous. The SAR coordinators had to adopt a strategy based on Garrett's capabilities. They had to think like Garrett. They assumed that if an accident occurred, it wouldn't be on an easy trail. It would be on a high-consequence segmenta, steep descent, where speeds could exceed 30 miles per hour. A narrow ridge with significant exposure where a momentary lapse in concentration could be fatal, or a technical rock feature requiring precision and commitment. The search focused on the black diamond routes, the ones that pushed the limits of skill and endurance.
The scale of the operation was immense. The air was filled with the constant thrum of helicopters equipped with thermal imaging technology. They flew low grid-patterned routes over the ridges and canyons, scanning the landscape for any heat signature that might indicate human presence or a flash of unnatural color, the bright yellow of their jerseys, the cyan of Garrett's bike, or the distinctive red and white of Bryson's. On the ground, teams composed of experienced mountaineers, local expert bikers volunteering their time, and SAR personnel began the grueling process of covering the terrain. They were looking for very specific indicators. In the dry, dusty conditions of mid-July, a high-speed crash should leave a mark on the earth. They searched for long skid marks, disturbed earth where a rider might have tumbled off the trail, impact points on trees or rocks, or the debris field that typically accompanies a major accident: broken bike components, helmets, or discarded gear. On the second day of the search, a crucial piece of information emerged. Investigators located two hikers who distinctly remembered seeing the pair around 2 p.m. on July 15th. They were observed near a junction leading toward the Skyline descent, an expert-level high-elevation trail known for its technical difficulty and severe exposure. The hikers recalled being impressed by the boys' confidence on such difficult terrain. They reported that the father and son seemed energetic, well-equipped, and entirely comfortable. They were moving at a strong pace, seemingly engaged in nothing more than a challenging afternoon ride. This became the last confirmed sighting. The focus of the search narrowed intensely on the Skyline descent. This was rugged, unforgiving territory. Specialized technical rope teams were deployed to search the steep slopes and cliffs below the trail. They rappelled into deep ravines, utilizing high-powered binoculars to scan the landscape below, looking for anything that seemed out of place in the vast expanse of granite and pine. The physical effort was exhausting, conducted under the relentless high-altitude sun, where dehydration and fatigue were constant threats to the searchers themselves. Yet, despite the concentrated effort, the search yielded a disturbing void. The wilderness offered nothing. The trails showed typical usage, but there was no sign of the catastrophic event that would be required to incapacitate two experienced riders simultaneously. There were no water bottles, no energy bar wrappers, no tire tracks, suggesting a sudden stop or fall. The complete absence of evidence was baffling and deeply unsettling for the search teams. How could two people, along with two large, brightly colored mountain bikes, disappear without leaving a single trace? Mountain bikes are durable, but in a severe crash, they break. Gear gets scattered. The wilderness usually retains evidence of trauma. Here, there was only silence. Olivia Kinsley arrived at Tahoe 48 hours after the disappearance. The command center, a flurry of topographic maps, radio chatter, and exhausted personnel, became the focal point of her agonizing wait. The abstract urgency of the search became a visceral human tragedy with her presence. The family was known to be exceptionally close, described by friends as the idealized version of a modern family. Olivia's devastation was absolute. She provided investigators with detailed information about Garrett's riding habits, his specific gear preferences, and Bryson's developing skills, anything that might help narrow the search parameters. But beneath her cooperation, Olivia was privately battling a crushing weight of guilt. The delay in reporting them missing the night she waited, assuming they were fine, haunted her relentlessly. She kept replaying her decision to go to bed, rationalizing their silence. In SAR operations, every hour counts. She couldn't shake the agonizing thought that if she had called the hotel on the evening of the 15th, if she had raised the alarm hours earlier, perhaps Garrett and Bryson would have been found injured but alive. This guilt, investigators noted, was a relentless undercurrent to her grief, a private torture that the ongoing uncertainty only amplified. As days turned into a week, the probability of survival diminished rapidly. The theories shifted. While an accident remained the most plausible explanation, the lack of a crash site opened the door to other, darker possibilities. Wildlife attacks were considered but dismissed. An attack capable of taking down two people would leave significant evidence. An intentional disappearance was ruled out by everyone who knew Garrett's devotion to his family. Abduction seemed the least likely scenario on a remote mountain trail, yet it couldn't be entirely excluded. After 3 weeks of exhaustive searching, the terrain had been covered repeatedly. Resources were dwindling, and hope was fading. The active search operation was officially scaled down. The disappearance of Garrett and Bryson Kinsley became a haunting local mystery. The story of two riders who embarked on the Skyline descent and were never seen again. The case didn't just go cold, it froze solid. For 5 years, the Kinsley case remained a painful enigma, a file tucked away in the cold case unit symbolizing a profound and unsettling lack of answers. Olivia Kinsley continued to live in the shadow of that July day, trapped in an ambiguous grief, unable to mourn, unable to move on. The vast wilderness around Tahoe held its secrets. The trails Garrett and Bryson loved seemed indifferent to the tragedy they concealed. The investigation was suspended, awaiting a break that seemed increasingly unlikely to ever come. The break arrived not from a renewed investigation, a remembered detail, or a technological advancement. It came from sheer chance in a place far from where the original search had focused. It was August 2022. Ronan Vesper was a man who sought solitude in the stark beauty of the high desert. An experienced solo camper, he often ventured off-trail, navigating the remote backcountry with a map and compass. He was currently exploring a desolate, arid canyon system many miles southeast of the Granite Loop area. This landscape was dramatically different from the pine forests where the search had concentrated. It was characterized by steep, eroding cliffs of light brown rock and compacted earth, a rugged terrain carved by the winding river at the canyon bottom. It was an environment of exposure and isolation. Vesper was hiking near the base of a massive cliff face, scouting for a safe campsite away from potential flash flood zones. The cliff rose approximately 160 feet above him, a sheer wall of layered, unstable rock. The afternoon sun was harsh, baking the landscape and casting complex shadows across the textured surface. The air was still and heavy with the scent of dry earth. As he stopped to take a drink, scanning the upper reaches of the canyon wall, a glint of something unnatural caught his eye. High above, It was a flash of color and light that didn't belong in the monotonous tan and brown of the rock face. It was located perhaps 50 feet below the rim. He squinted, trying to make sense of the shape, but the distance and the glare made it difficult. Assuming it might be old mining debris or trash washed down during a storm, Vesper unclipped a pair of compact binoculars from his pack. He focused the lenses on the anomaly. What he saw was so bizarre, so utterly out of place, that it took several moments for his brain to process the image. Jammed vertically into a deep, narrow fissure in the cliff wall were two mountain bikes. They were stacked one on top of the other, wedged tightly into the crack, as if they had fallen from the sky and embedded themselves in the rock. Vesper was an experienced outdoorsman. He understood the realities of the backcountry. People didn't just dump high-end mountain bikes in such a remote location. His immediate thought was an accident. He knew there were trails near the canyon rim above. Perhaps riders had gone over the edge. But the placement was profoundly strange. They weren't lying on the scree slope at the bottom. They were suspended high above, caught in the rock like a bizarre sculpture. He looked closer through the binoculars, adjusting the focus to capture the details. His sense of isolation suddenly replaced by a growing unease. The lower bike was unmistakably bright red and white. He could distinctly see a white coil spring for the rear suspension, a specific feature that stood out starkly against the dusty backdrop. Above it, partially obscured by shadow, was a cyan-colored bike. They were coated in a thick layer of dust and dirt, clearly having been there for a significant amount of time, but they were recognizable as high-quality machines. The scene struck Vesper as deeply wrong. The physics seemed unlikely for an accident. If two riders had fallen, the chances of both their bikes catching in the same narrow fissure were astronomical. It looked less like the aftermath of a fall, and more like the bikes had been intentionally discarded from the top. He visualized the scenario. Someone throwing the bikes over the edge, expecting them to tumble to the canyon floor, or into the river below. But by some incredible fluke, they had snagged in the fissure.
If riders had fallen, where were they? Had they plummeted past the fissure? The situation felt ominous. Recognizing that this remote section of the canyon rarely saw visitors, and that this discovery might be significant, Vesper carefully marked the GPS coordinates. He took several photographs, zooming in as much as possible. He felt a pressing need to report this, an urgency that overshadowed his desire for solitude. He then began the long hike out to the nearest point where he could get a cell signal. He called the local sheriff's department and reported the finding, emphasizing the strangeness of the location and his concern that it might be related to a serious incident. The initial response from the authorities was measured. They received calls about abandoned gear frequently, and the location Vesper described was difficult to access. A deputy was dispatched the following morning to verify the report. After hiking into the canyon with Vesper, the deputy was confronted with the same surreal sight. The visual impact was undeniable. He photographed the scene extensively, using a high-powered lens to zoom in on the details of the bikes. The deputy agreed that the situation was highly unusual, but retrieving the bikes would be a complex and dangerous operation. It wasn't something to be undertaken lightly if they were merely discarded property. The deputy returned to the station with the photographs, intending to file a report and discuss the logistics of retrieval. Back at the station, the procedure was to check reports of stolen or missing property in the area. The photographs were uploaded and cross-referenced with active and cold missing persons. Cases involving outdoor recreation in the Tahoe region. It was a routine check, not expected to yield significant results given the apparent age of the bikes. The system returned a match almost immediately. The atmosphere in the station shifted instantly. Now the deputies pulled up the cold case file for Garrett and Bryson Kinsley. They looked at the photograph Olivia had provided 5 years earlier, the smiling father and son with their gear. They compared it to the images taken in the canyon. The distinctive red and white frame, the specific configuration of the white suspension coil, and the contrasting cyan bike were an unequivocal match. This wasn't abandoned gear. These were the key pieces of evidence in the 5-year-old disappearance. The discovery instantly reignited the cold case, but it also deepened the mystery. How did the bikes end up wedged in a cliff face miles from where the pair was last seen? And where were the riders? The positive identification of the bikes transformed the remote canyon from a desolate landscape into a critical crime scene. The initial hesitation regarding the difficulty of retrieval was replaced by an urgent mobilization of resources. This was the first tangible lead in the Kinsley case in 5 years, and preserving the integrity of the evidence was paramount. The location, however, remained a formidable obstacle. The bikes were embedded in a sheer, eroding cliff face, inaccessible from the bottom and perilous to reach from the top. A specialized technical rescue team, experienced in high Angel recovery operations, was assembled and arrived at the canyon rim at dawn the following day. The terrain itself was a significant hazard. The compacted earth and layered rock that formed the cliff were unstable, prone to crumbling under weight or vibration. The air was tense with the gravity of the situation and the physical danger involved. The team had to establish secure anchor points far back from the edge, utilizing natural features on the more stable ground of the plateau. Recognizing that the cliff rim itself could not be trusted, the recovery operation was slow, methodical, and dangerous. 2 technicians rappelled down the 160-foot face, dangling precariously as loose debris occasionally rained down around them, echoing off the canyon walls. Their primary objective was to secure the bikes and document their position in situ with high-resolution photography before attempting to move them. Any careless movement could dislodge the bikes, sending them tumbling to the canyon floor and potentially destroying crucial forensic clues. Suspended by ropes, the technicians worked delicately. The bikes were jammed tightly into the narrow fissure, the pressure of the rock holding them firmly in place. It became clear that the force of the impact had been significant. It took several hours of careful manipulation, using leveraged tools and stabilizing ropes to free them from the rock's grasp. The process was painstaking, each movement calculated to preserve the integrity of the objects. Once freed, they were secured in specialized harnesses and slowly, carefully lowered to the investigators, waiting anxiously at the base of the cliff. With the bikes finally on solid ground, the forensic examination began immediately at the scene before they were transported. They were heavily weathered, the metal oxidized, and the rubber components degraded by 5 years of exposure to the harsh alpine desert climate, intense summer heat, and freezing winters. But they were remarkably intact. The initial assessment focused on identifying the cause of the fall. Investigators searched for signs typically associated with a high-speed crash or a rider losing control and going over an edge. They expected to find cracked frames, severely bent wheels, or handlebars twisted at unnatural angles from a sudden violent impact while under the weight of a rider. While the bikes certainly showed damage, scratches, dents, and bends consistent with falling a significant distance and impacting the rock fissure, the catastrophic structural damage associated with a riding accident was conspicuously absent. The damage profile suggested the bikes had tumbled freely through the air before impact. More critically, forensic specialists conducted an exhaustive search for trace biological evidence. If Garrett and Bryson had been riding the bikes when they went over the cliff, there would almost certainly be evidence of trauma transferred onto the equipment. They used alternate light sources and chemical reagents to examine the handlebars, seats, pedals, and impact points. Looking for blood, tissue, or fibers from their clothing, they found none. The bikes were clean of any discernible biological material from the victims. While 5 years of exposure could degrade evidence, the tight spaces and joints of the bikes usually protected some trace material. The absence was stark. The combined evidence strongly suggested a disturbing conclusion. The bikes were not being ridden when they left the cliff top. They had gone over the edge without Garrett and Bryson. This realization forced a complete revaluation of the scene. Investigators shifted their attention to the topography and the physics of the fall. A team of experts, including accident reconstruction specialists and physicists, analyzed the cliff top, the trajectory, and the narrow fissure where the bikes had landed. The cliff edge was relatively clear, with a trail running nearby. The experts analyzed the mechanics required for an accident. The probability of both Garrett and Bryson accidentally riding off the cliff at the exact same moment, at the exact same spot, and with the precise trajectory needed to land in that specific narrow fissure, was deemed a statistical impossibility. The probability was infinitesimally small. Given Garrett's expertise, the scenario was even more absurd. He was not a rider who made reckless mistakes, especially with his son present. The reconstruction specialists concluded that the evidence was entirely inconsistent with an accidental fall. The only plausible explanation was that the bikes had been intentionally thrown from the cliff top. The investigation then focused on the likely intent behind such an act. At the base of the cliff, the canyon floor led to a swift-moving river, deep enough in sections, especially during the spring melt, to wash away large objects. The emerging theory was chillingly straightforward. Someone had attempted to dispose of the bikes by throwing them into the river, intending for them to be washed away or hidden forever in the deep water. The fact that they had snagged in the fissure was an incredible accident of physics, a fluke that preserved the evidence against all odds. This fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation. This was no longer a missing persons case rooted in a presumed accident. It was now unequivocally a suspected homicide investigation. With this new understanding, the area surrounding the cliff became the subject of an intense search. If the bikes were thrown from the top, perhaps the actual incident occurred nearby. The trail above was examined minutely for any residual evidence of a struggle, but 5 years of exposure and erosion had sanitized the area. Simultaneously, the river below was targeted. If the perpetrator had intended the bikes to land in the river, it was highly probable that Garrett and Bryson's bodies had met the same fate. Dive teams were brought in along with advanced sonar equipment. They systematically scanned the riverbed, navigating the cold water and strong currents. Divers investigated anomalies detected by the sonar, probing the murky depths for any sign of remains. The river search was extensive, covering miles downstream. But despite the technology and the exhaustive effort, they found nothing. The discovery of the bikes had confirmed the suspicion of foul play, but it had brought investigators no closer to finding Garrett and Bryson. With the physical evidence strongly suggesting a deliberate act and the exhaustive search of the canyon yielding no remains, the investigation pivoted from the terrain back to the victims. The discovery of the bikes had shattered the assumption of an accident, forcing detectives to look at Garrett Kinsley's life through the lens of a potential homicide. It would have the motive, the opportunity, and the ruthlessness to make a father and son disappear and then attempt such a calculated disposal of the evidence. The initial investigation in 2017 had painted Garrett as a dedicated family man and a respected figure in the community, but as the cold case team delved deeper into his professional life, they began to understand the high-stakes world he inhabited. Garrett was not just an expert rider, he was a key player in the specialized and surprisingly cutthroat industry of mountain bike trail development. This wasn't about clearing paths in the woods. It was a multi-million-dollar business driven by tourism, corporate sponsorships, and land development contracts. In 2017, Garrett was on the cusp of finalizing a massive new project near Tahoe. This trail system, backed by major sponsors, was poised to become a premier international destination. It was a career-defining achievement for Garrett, promising significant financial success and professional acclaim. But in the zero-sum game of regional tourism, Garrett's success was poised to deliver a fatal blow to others. Investigators focused on the impact of his new project on existing businesses. They discovered that the new development was expected to devastate an older, struggling bike park in the region known as Summit Slopes. Summit Slopes had once been a popular destination but had fallen on hard times, plagued by outdated infrastructure and declining visitor numbers. Garrett's state-of-the-art project was essentially going to siphon off the remaining customer base, ensuring the older park's demise. The owner of Summit Slopes was Weston Price. Price was a longtime fixture in the local biking scene, a man whose entire identity and livelihood were tied to the success of his park. The investigation uncovered a deep, simmering resentment that had boiled over into open hostility. Detectives conducted interviews with members of the close-knit professional biking community, local business owners, and attendees of regional planning meetings. The picture they painted was one of an increasingly toxic rivalry. Price had publicly accused Garrett of unethical business practices, claiming he had stolen concepts and used his influence to fast-track his permits. While strangling Summit Slopes, witnesses recounted heated arguments at trade shows and community meetings, confrontations that bordered on physical altercations. Price saw Garrett not just as a competitor, but as the architect of his impending ruin. Detectives reviewed the initial case files from 2017. Price had been interviewed briefly. He had acknowledged the rivalry but framed it as standard business tension. He provided an alibi for the afternoon of July 15th, claiming he was working alone on equipment maintenance at his park. Given the lack of evidence suggesting foul play at the time, and the strong assumption of an accident, his alibi was accepted without rigorous verification, and he was dismissed as a person of interest. 5 years later, that unverified alibi seemed suspiciously convenient. Price had a powerful motive born of desperation, but motive was not enough. They needed a physical link connecting Price to the crime. The only physical evidence they had were the two bicycles recovered from the cliff. They had already undergone a standard forensic examination, but the lead detective ordered a second microscopic review. He instructed the forensic technicians to dismantle the bikes completely, bolt by bolt, and examine every surface, every crevice under high magnification. They were looking for anything that didn't belong, any trace evidence that might have been transferred during the incident. The process was painstaking, taking several days. The technicians meticulously cataloged every scratch and dent, analyzing the dried mud and debris still packed into the complex mechanics. It was during the examination of Garrett's Cyan bike that the breakthrough occurred. The technician was focusing on the rear suspension linkage, a tight, complex assembly of pivots, bearings, and moving parts. Jammed deep within one of the pivots, almost invisible to the naked eye and missed during the initial examination, was a small piece of metal, oxidized and covered in grime. But it was distinctly different from the surrounding components of Garrett's bike. It was carefully extracted using specialized tools. The object was small, circular, and made of aluminum. The lab technicians cleaned the object and analyzed its composition and design. It wasn't a fragment of a broken part. It was a complete component. An expert in bicycle mechanics was brought in and identified it. It was a pedal spacer. Pedal spacers are used by some riders to widen their stance on the bike, fitting between the pedal and the crank arm. They are relatively common, but this one was distinct. It wasn't a mass-produced item. The forensic metallurgist determined the specific alloy composition, a high-grade aluminum not typically used in standard components. Furthermore, the surface showed unique machining marks, the microscopic grooves left by the tools that shaped it. This indicated it was custom-made, likely part of a small bespoke batch. The discovery was electrifying. This small piece of aluminum was foreign to Garrett's bike. Its location, deep within the suspension linkage, suggested it had become lodged there during a forceful impact or struggle, perhaps where another bike had collided violently with Garrett's. It was the kind of trace evidence that could break a case wide open, but only if they could determine its origin. The abstract search for motive was now grounded in a physical clue. The investigation now had a singular focus: trace the origin of the custom spacer. The investigation hinged on the oxidized aluminum spacer. Identifying its origin became the absolute priority for the investigative team. This was not an off-the-shelf component. It was custom work, which meant it was traceable, but the process would be laborious. Detectives began the arduous task of canvassing specialized machine shops across Northern California and Nevada. They were looking for a machinist who worked with a specific high-grade aluminum alloy and, more critically, could identify the unique tool marks left on the spacer. The search was exhaustive and frustrating. Detectives visited dozens of shops, from large industrial fabricators to small specialized operations catering to automotive and motorcycle enthusiasts. They carried high-resolution photographs of the spacer in the metallurgical analysis. Most machinists couldn't identify it. The machining marks, while unique, required a familiarity with the specific tools and techniques used to create them. Weeks passed with a growing sense that this crucial lead might turn into a dead end. The break came when the investigation focused on shops specializing in high-end bicycle component prototyping. The world of custom bicycle machining is small and specialized. They found a small independent machine shop in Reno operated by an older machinist known for his precision work. He examined the photographs of the spacer. He didn't recognize the part immediately, but he recognized the pattern of the milling. He asked for the alloy specifications. After reviewing the data, he began to recall the job. He was meticulous about his records and his equipment. He went back through his archived invoices and work orders from 2016 and 2017. He confirmed that he had produced a small batch of those exact spacers several years prior. The machining marks, he explained, were consistent with an older lathe he had since replaced. The specifications were unusually precise, requiring a specific tolerance that he remembered being challenging to achieve. When asked who the client was, machinist provided the name Weston Price. The machinist confirmed that Price was a demanding customer, was particular about his bike setup, and often requested custom components for his personal bikes. The spacer found jammed in Garrett Kinsley's bike was definitively linked to Weston Price. This physical link was the breakthrough the investigators needed. It tied Weston Price directly to Garrett Kinsley's bicycle at the time of the incident. The implication was that Price's bike, equipped with these custom spacers, had come into forceful contact with Garrett's bike, likely during a confrontation. With this evidence in hand, detectives dug deeper into Weston Price's situation in 2017. The financial records were stark. Summit Slopes was not just struggling, it was doomed. Bankruptcy filings were imminent, and Price was personally liable for significant debts. His livelihood, his identity, and his financial future were on the verge of collapse, and Garrett Kinsley was the direct cause. The investigation then uncovered a crucial, ironic detail that had been overlooked in the initial investigation, but now held profound significance. While Price was publicly hostile towards Garrett's new project, he was also desperate for income. Investigators examined the contracts, permits, and work logs associated with Garrett's new trail system and found that Weston Price had been subcontracted to perform some of the initial excavation work on a remote section of the project. This revelation was staggering. Price was literally building the project that was destroying him. It meant Price had intimate knowledge of the remote terrain where the project was underway. More importantly, it placed Price at the scene with heavy machinery excavators and bulldozers around the time of the disappearance. Detectives pulled the detailed plans and work logs for the trail construction. They compared the original planned route designed by Garrett with the trail as it was eventually built. They were looking for any deviations, any anomalies in the construction timeline that coincided with July 2017. They found one. The record showed that shortly after Garrett and Bryson vanished, Weston Price had filed a change order to alter the route of the trail in a specific sector he was excavating. The justification he provided on the paperwork was unstable ground conditions and subsurface rock formations, requiring the trail to be diverted around a section of hillside. This reroute had been approved without much scrutiny at the time. Such changes were common in large construction projects. The location of the reroute was isolated, far from the main access points, and several miles from the cliff where the bikes were eventually found, but connected by service roads. Armed with the suspicion that unstable ground might be a cover story for something far more sinister, investigators organized an operation to search the area Price had diverted the trail away from. In September 2022, a team of investigators, archaeologists specializing in ground disturbance analysis, and a team of specialized cadaver dogs arrived at the site. The area was overgrown now, the unused path reclaimed by 5 years of wilderness growth, making the terrain difficult to read. The dogs were deployed to search the area that the original trail was supposed to cross. The terrain was difficult, covered in dense brush and pine needles. The dogs worked the grid systematically, their handlers watching intently for any change in behavior. Within a few hours, one of the dogs gave a clear alert, indicating the presence of human decomposition scent. The alert was focused on a section of ground near a cluster of large pine trees, precisely on the path Garrett had originally designed, but that Price had diverted away from. The area was secured as a crime scene. The forensic anthropology team was brought in to conduct a meticulous excavation. The process was slow. The soil was removed layer by layer. The soil was hard-packed and rocky. As they dug deeper, the tension was palpable. The depth of the potential grave suggested it was not dug by hand. Several feet down, the excavator struck something solid. The team proceeded with hand tools and brushes. They uncovered the heavily degraded remains of an adult male. The depth and compaction of the soil indicated that the burial had been done using professional excavation equipment, consistent with the machinery Price had been operating at the site. The mountain was finally yielding its secrets. The remains discovered beneath the rerouted trail section were carefully exhumed and sent for forensic analysis. Through dental records, the forensic odontologist quickly confirmed the identity. It was Garrett Kinsley. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was massive blunt force trauma to the head, inflicted by a heavy object with a distinct edge. The 5-year mystery of what happened to Garrett Kinsley had been solved. He was murdered. Weston Price was arrested at his home. Summit Slopes had long since gone bankrupt, and Price had been living a marginal existence, seemingly haunted by the failure of his business. When confronted by the detectives, he appeared resigned, the years of holding the secret having eroded his defenses. He was brought into the interrogation room where the accumulated weight of the investigation was about to be brought to bear. The detectives laid out the evidence methodically, constructing an airtight narrative of motive, opportunity, and physical evidence. They presented the financial records, demonstrating his desperation and the intense rivalry. They detailed his involvement in the excavation of Garrett Strell and the precise location where the body was found, directly beneath the section he had suspiciously rerouted. Finally, they placed the oxidized aluminum pedal spacer on the metal table between them. They explained how it was traced back to his custom order and found jammed in the suspension of Garrett's bike. The evidence was insurmountable. Price, realizing the impossibility of his situation, waived his right to an attorney and confessed. But the story he told was self-serving, minimizing his intent while admitting the act. According to Price, he had arranged to meet Garrett on the trail system on the afternoon of July 15, 2017. He claimed his intention was to confront Garrett one last time, to argue about the project and the impending ruin of Summit Slopes. He stated he didn't anticipate Garrett bringing his son Bryson. The meeting took place on a remote section of the trail near the area where Price was conducting excavation work. Price claimed the conversation quickly escalated into a shouting match. Garrett allegedly dismissed Price's pleas, fueling his desperation and anger. The argument turned physical. Price recounted that during the struggle, their bikes collided violently, explaining the transfer of the pedal spacer. The fight escalated rapidly. Near where they were standing was a collection of heavy trail maintenance tools staged for the construction work. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, Price grabbed a Pulaski, a heavy, formidable tool, combining an axe and an adze commonly used in trail building and firefighting. He swung it at Garrett. The blow was fatal. Garrett collapsed instantly. The description of the weapon matched the forensic findings of the blunt force trauma. Price described a scene of immediate panic and horror. He realized he had just killed a man, and the act had been witnessed by the man's 12-year-old son. This is where Price's narrative concerning Bryson took a sharp, calculated turn. When questioned intently about the boy, Price's demeanor shifted. He became evasive. He insisted that Bryson, upon witnessing the violent attack on his father, was paralyzed by fear for a moment, then turned his bike and rode away rapidly down a treacherous, unfinished section of the trail, desperate to escape the scene. Price claimed he was focused on the reality of what he had just done to Garrett and that Bryson's flight was a blur. He maintained he never saw the boy again. Price then detailed the cover-up. Terrified, he used the excavation equipment he had on site to bury Garrett's body deep in the path of the planned trail. He knew he could later alter the route and effectively hide the grave forever under the guise of construction necessity. He then addressed the bikes. He realized they had to disappear. He claimed he found Bryson's bike abandoned nearby, perhaps after the boy crashed or fled on foot. He transported both bikes several miles to the arid canyon area. He chose the spot above the river because he believed the water was deep and swift enough to wash the evidence away. He threw them over the edge, never realizing they had snagged in the fissure high on the cliff wall. The detectives listened to the confession with intense skepticism. Price's account of Bryson's fate felt too convenient. A calculated minimization of his actions, attempting to frame the situation as a single murder rather than a double homicide. The inconsistencies in his story about retrieving Bryson's bike were glaring. The investigation needed confirmation. Authorities executed a search warrant on Weston Price's property, including the dilapidated buildings and storage containers of the defunct Summit Slopes bike park. The search was extensive, looking for any evidence related to Bryson Kinsley. In an old rusting shipping container used for storing old equipment and machinery, investigators made a discovery that shattered Price's narrative about the boy. Hidden beneath a tarp and a pile of old tires, they found a child's biking helmet. It was white with distinctive red designs. It was identical to the helmet Bryson Kinsley was wearing in the photograph provided by Olivia and the one he was wearing on the day he disappeared. The presence of the helmet in Price's possession proved that Bryson had not ridden away from the scene wearing his safety gear. Price had lied. The implication was dark and immediate. Price knew exactly what had happened to the boy, and the truth was far more sinister than a panicked flight. The discovery of the helmet solidified the case against Weston Price. He was tried and convicted of the murder of Garrett Kinsley. Despite the overwhelming evidence contradicting his story and the presence of the helmet, Price steadfastly refused to alter his account regarding Bryson. He offered no information about what happened to the boy after Garrett was killed. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The conviction brought a measure of justice for Garrett. But for Olivia Kinsley, the uncertainty surrounding Bryson remained an unending torment. The investigation, however, did not end with the sentencing. Detectives continued to analyze the evidence, searching for anything that might lead them to Bryson. A final exhaustive forensic audit was conducted on Weston Price's activities in the weeks following the murder in 2017. They meticulously reviewed financial transactions, phone records, and any available data on his movements. They discovered a significant irregularity: a long-distance trip taken by Price just 3 days after the disappearance. Before the initial search had even been scaled down, GPS data from Price's vehicle obtained via a warrant showed he had driven hundreds of miles north, deep into a remote region of Idaho. The destination was isolated, far from any major population centers. Digging deeper into Price's background, investigators identified a distant cousin who lived in that area. Further investigation revealed that this cousin operated an unlicensed, controversial wilderness therapy camp for troubled youths. These camps were known for minimal oversight, poor record-keeping, and operating on the fringes of legality, often taking in children with few questions asked. A chilling theory emerged. Detectives theorized that Price, perhaps unwilling to physically murder a child but needing him to disappear permanently, had transported Bryson to this remote facility. It was a place where a traumatized child could be absorbed into a system designed to break down and rebuild identities. A team of detectives traveled to Idaho to follow the lead. However, the trail was cold. They found that the camp had been shut down and abandoned years prior following regulatory crackdowns. The property was deserted. Furthermore, they learned that Price's cousin had passed away in 2021. There were no surviving records of the children who had passed through the camp. For Olivia Kinsley, this final discovery offered a painful ambiguity. It presented the possibility that Bryson might have survived the initial crime, potentially living for years unaware of his true identity. But the trail ended in the silent Idaho wilderness. While justice was served for Garrett, Bryson's ultimate fate remained definitively unknown. The discovery of Garrett's body brought a grim, heartbreaking conclusion to his story, but it was a truth that finally broke the 5-year silence. Weston Price was brought to justice, his web of lies and deceit finally exposed. Yet for Olivia, and for all who followed this tragic case, a profound void remains. The mountain held its secrets for 5 years, but it seems to have given up only a part of them. The ultimate fate of Bryson Kinsley, a young boy who went on a birthday trip with his father and never returned, is a question that may never be answered. His memory, like his spirit, is lost somewhere between the dark truth of a murder and the silent mystery of the Idaho wilderness. It's a story that reminds us how a single act of rage can shatter a family, and how some secrets, buried deep by time and a killer's desperation, may remain hidden forever.